with a look at the economy in the company of one of the most experienced and liked politicians in the country. Lord Kenneth Clarke, welcome to Talk Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Brilliant to have you. Thanks for making the time. Lord Clarke, the British economy hasn't seen a trauma on this scale since the Second World War. Are the fundamentals of the British economy such that we can recover from this?
We certainly can recover, but it's not going to be quick and easy for most of us, or most of the economy. We are going to have to work very hard over the next 2 or 3 years to make sure that we look credible, that we are going to be able to cover our debt and not be overwhelmed by the vast debts that we've had to run up, and also to help support people get back into a modern economy, which is actually developing businesses which have a future and which are in the kind of things that are going to be the basis of a modern economy for the next 20, 30 years. The idea we just have a nice, simple bounce back once the disease has gone away is, I think, an illusion. And it's not only in economic affairs. This thing is going to leave quite a lot of scars on our society.
Yes. As a former Chancellor, has it been the right move to borrow hundreds of billions of pounds to more or less underwrite the British economy?
It has been necessary and the right thing to do to borrow huge sums of money that you wouldn't do in normal times, to make sure that you save as many viable businesses as possible and you save as many jobs as possible and you keep as many people in touch with the secure jobs that should come back to them once the crisis is over. Yes, I think you had to abandon all the normal fiscal rules, but knowing that you were piling up a huge problem, possibly for the near future, by piling up debts that no responsible government would otherwise have thought of. But in this quite unprecedented crisis, I mean, some people compare it to the great freeze of the early 18th century as the last time we had a fall in the economy to this extent. No, these exceptional measures were justified, and we're not the only country to have done it.
And when you became Chancellor, you inherited huge economic problems, and it's agreed across the political spectrum that you presided over a sustained recovery and a rebuild for the British economy. That's your legacy. In terms of your experience at number 11, what might you have done differently if you were in post?
Oh, well, looking back, funny enough, nothing instantly leaps to mind, which may show what an opinionated guy I am. I mean, I did tackle a big fiscal deficit. We were beginning to recover from the recession. Norman Lamont had started, but he got himself bogged down and sadly went under a political bus. I inherited a huge fiscal problem. I had to cut public spending. I had to raise taxation. And I invented 1 or 2 new taxes. And I followed what I thought was sensible monetary policy because I was still responsible, the Chancellor was still responsible for interest rates in those days. As you say, we achieved growth with low inflation for not the first time, certainly the longest period since the war, and we handed over a good economy to the Blair government. But it was quite tough going, and I'm sorry I can't confess an error, but it's always unwise when you're a politician. But I can't remember.
No, I think
I wouldn't do anything basically different without sounding too self-satisfied with my performance.
Well, the numbers speak for themselves, and I'm sure that you're on Tony Blair's Christmas card list for the economy that he inherited, which created the impression that somehow New Labour was a fantastic administration for the economy. Well, what they inherited was pretty healthy.
They wouldn't change my figures on tax and spending for the first 3 years, I think, and then they had a glorious boom because we had a thing called the dot-com bubble, which rather exaggerated it. There we are.
How about this time round, Rishi Sunak, who was a little-known figure before the pandemic, but he is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Do you think that, you support the measures in principle. During the pandemic, might you have possibly borrowed a little less or allowed more companies to fall that perhaps weren't viable and which are supporting these rather sort of imaginary jobs?
No, I think overall, I think some of it was quite inspired. The scheme for what's called furloughing and so on, I think was very necessary, was very good. No, I applaud what he did. He's a hugely, frighteningly intelligent guy. He's a very nice guy. He's very inexperienced. I mean, he's a very experienced businessman, novice found himself in the middle of this great crisis. He made one or two errors, things as he did, because I would have been perhaps a little more prudent about individual elements of spending, knowing all the time that as I piled up this debt, I was going to have to deal with this debt as soon as we got out of trouble. But no, it's churlish to join in. It's easy with hindsight to say that, for instance, I think the stamp duty cut was a mistake, but there's not much else.
Yeah. You mentioned in your earlier answer that a chancellor has, I guess, two major levers at their disposal when it comes to the deficit, and it's either cutting spending or raising taxes. Which is it to be for Britain in 2021?
Well, I think you have to do both. I did both for quite a time, and I think he's got to do both, which means, of course, that's going to be unpopular. When you're a senior minister in a good government, I mean, particularly if you're chancellor, you have to take tough, difficult decisions. You ignore opinion polls because no one will thank you for having done something popular if it all goes wrong after 6 months. It's the results you'll be judged by. And he needs to raise taxation where it can properly and safely be raised without damaging the economic recovery. And he needs to cut out wasteful spending of the kind which, could have been tackled by former chancellors, but can't be afforded now. And he's got to urge the utmost constraint on his colleagues, get them all to start resisting lobbies, but because you will have ferocious lobbies. At the moment, the habit is to trail possible tax increases. And you're met with howls of outrage from lobbies saying that they want to pay more tax. What they say is it will ruin the economy. And every time you suggest that you're bringing to an end a temporary emergency spending measure, howls of rage. It's not the time yet. You must extend it, and so on. It requires some political skills and actually just persuading the bulk of the public, who I think are sensible, reasonable people, that they know we had to spend vast sums of money we hadn't got. We've been printing and borrowing it in order to save ourselves from collapsing the economy in the crisis. And we all know that we've now got to pay for it, make sure that the markets, the world trusts us as being at knowing what we're going to do to get back to a sustainable fiscal position. So that's a rather broad-brush description of his overall view.
Well, I mean, Lord Clarke,
and everybody else will.
Lord Clarke, I completely concur with your idea that our politicians must be willing to be unpopular in the national interest. You served under Margaret Thatcher, who at times was a divisive figure but had a clear vision for the country.
Unpopular policies. She never read newspapers, and she never took any notice of opinion polls. Over the last 20 years, there's been a growing tendency for a swarm of public relations people to give them too much power at the centre of government in Downing Street, and they very easily persuade their boss and quite a few of the ministers that you should take policy from what focus groups seem to like and so on. No way of running a Welch stall, and certainly no way of getting yourself out of what will be very difficult times.
Well, yeah.
To get back to economic health and give people proper jobs and the prospect of rising living standards again.
Well, indeed, and you've not shirked from a bit of strategic unpopularity yourself, Lord Clarke. You were Justice Secretary under the coalition government, who I think are in many ways unsung heroes of this pandemic, because it was the financial discipline and the reduction of the deficit that gave the current Chancellor so much borrowing power.
Yeah, I defend George Osborne. It was necessary to tackle the quite bloated public spending plans that we inherited. It was actually quite easy for the first 2 years. There wasn't too much fuss about cuts in any of our departments because there was so much fat in the system that had been put there in Gordon Brown's final years, when he got carried away by the fact that artificial bubbles in the markets and so on gave him extra tax, which he spent all that extra tax and he then borrowed too much on top. All that had to be sorted out to save us from what would have been calamity if our financial credibility had collapsed. Thereafter, it got difficult. And we didn't cut some things. I mean, the health service has never been cut by any government since it was founded just after the Second World War. It's had real terms increases in spending under every government and every chancellor since, including when I was Health Secretary, including when I was Chancellor Exchequer, and including under George Osborne. Of course, you still get ferocious lobbies because there's such rising demand in health that you never run out of things that people very understandably, desirably want to spend money on. But other departments, every other department did get put under constraint. It got more and more difficult as you went on. With hindsight, there's an argument, did we keep it too strict for too long? Not quite sure.
Indeed. Well, you cut your department, I think Justice Department, by 40%. So you certainly walked the walk. But you will be aware, Lord Clarke, of the toxic nature of austerity as a political problem for any government. So, I mean, are we looking at 5 to 10 years of austerity, the like of which we saw in the early noughties?
No, I don't think so. As I've already said.
But isn't the deficit much bigger this time round?
People know in their bones that someone's going to have to raise taxation. Most people will tell you, well, that's right, raise tax from the very rich who annoy us all by being ostentatiously multimillionaires, billionaires. Some of them get very, very unpopular. It'd be very nice if we could just take all the money away from them and it would pay for everything. I'm afraid there aren't enough of them. Most of them leave the country. They certainly do if you start trying to raise high levels of tax on them. They're left in droves in my youth. And there were no great sports stars who lived in the United Kingdom the ones that made a lot of money when I was a boy. Or not a boy, a bit later than that. You can't. There simply aren't enough super rich to pay for everything. The ordinary person and the ordinary business has got to take a fair share of the burden of paying to get us back to a sustainable situation. Otherwise, you just sit around waiting till we get normal interest rates starting to come back because inflation's starting to go up. We're back to normality. And then the problem of paying the interest and potentially ever repaying this vast sum of debt will hit us, could cause quite a financial crisis, the classic fall in the pound and so on. Now, you can say, Boris might say, I'm going to cross my fingers and we'll cross that bridge when it comes, and it'll be long after my time. But I don't think you can count on that. Inflation's not going to go up. Interest rates aren't going to go up in the next 12 months or so. 2-3 years' time, perfectly possible. And it's no good doing nothing until you have an acute financial crisis. But Rishi has got to raise some taxation, like raising corporation tax to a more sensible level. George took that down rather a long way, and so on. As soon as he can, preferably starting to give a signal in March. And the government's got to explain to people this is in the national interest. We pulled together as a country to defeat the disease. We've now we borrowed and printed a lot of money that we haven't got. Now we have to pull together as a country, share out fairly the burden of paying for it, which means the better off pay more, and those that can pay, and you don't put tax on those who can't afford it. And silly public spending or unnecessary public spending has got to be cut out, because there are some things you're going to want to spend more money on. You're going to carry on spending more money in the light of this crisis. Social care, for a start, jobs training, job location. We'll all need more money spent on them as we come out of the problem.
Lord Clarke, finally, you've been in politics for decades. You were Father of the House, and you've held some of the most important offices of state over many decades under many prime ministers. You also had that Johnsonian ability to connect with people that wouldn't normally vote Conservative. So my question to you is as follows. Does Boris have the chops to lead us through this crisis?
Well, we'll find out when Boris is allowed to be Prime Minister in normal times, what sort of Prime Minister he's going to be. We know what the style is going to be. Is he actually, capable of being a strong Prime Minister, persuading the government, the public to have trust in him and confidence in him, able to take these tough, difficult decisions? He's been plunged almost straight away into a completely unforeseen crisis that nobody would want to have to be plunged into, I'm afraid we'll only find out. And I'd also say, going back to your very flattering remarks about my standing in the country, wasn't always like that, you know. We're in the middle of big problems. When I was at the Health Secretary, fighting the BMA, the Doctors' Trades Union, over my health reforms, which have never been reversed, and in the middle of, say, the ambulance strike, I was one of the most unpopular people in the country. But had I given way to the lobbies and done what they were urging me to do, I'd have been more justly unpopular probably ever thereafter. So there we are. Now, as you say, the one claim I always make is I am the most popular Conservative in the country, with people who never voted Conservative in their lives. Now, what that tells you about my political position nowadays, I'm not remotely sure, but as I'm retired into the House of Lords, I no longer bother about those things.
Well, you're a great loss to the Commons, and I hope we get to hear your wise words on the national airwaves again very soon. Lord Kenneth Clarke, many thanks for joining us, former Chancellor, former Justice Secretary.